From the moment Shedeur Sanders stepped into the spotlight, analysts like Colin Cowherd framed his future around potential risks. Small sample size, transition questions, unproven tools. But when Sanders took over the field this week, what he delivered wasn't potential. It was polished, composed execution. He wasn't building a case, he was delivering the verdict. Each drive was a contradiction to what had been said about him. By the time the final whistle blew, Cowherd's earlier takes felt not just outdated, but disconnected from what Sanders had clearly become.
If you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed.
The impact of that performance now ripples beyond one player. It challenges how the league and media value consistency over hype, composure over flash. With Sanders locked in as the Browns starter, this game may serve as the clearest proof yet that real evaluation happens in real time. What changed wasn't just one quarterback's status, it was the weight of results over reputation, and how quickly the NFL world has to catch up when a young player forces the issue. Colin Cowherd spent weeks planting his flag. The message was consistent, loud, and repeated often enough that it felt settled. Shedeur Sanders, according to Cowherd, wasn't ready. The tools were questioned. The ceiling was questioned. The translation to the NFL was treated like a stretch that required blind faith. And Cowherd wasn't alone, but he was the loudest voice carrying that skepticism into the mainstream. What made the criticism stick wasn't just the take itself, but the confidence behind it. This wasn't uncertainty. This wasn't cautious analysis. It was framed as conclusion. Sanders was talked about as a long-term project at best, a media creation at worst. Every misstep was amplified, every success minimized, and every performance filtered through the idea that the hype was ahead of the reality. That's the position Cowherd chose publicly. And when you choose it publicly, you're also choosing what happens when reality doesn't cooperate. Then the game happened. Not a quiet improvement. Not a statistical padding session. A statement. Shedeur Sanders delivered a performance that left no room for reinterpretation. Poise showed up immediately. The ball came out on time. Reads were decisive. The offense moved with clarity instead of hesitation, and Sanders looked like someone controlling the pace rather than reacting to it. This wasn't chaos ball. It was structured, calm, and efficient. Sanders operated like a quarterback who knew exactly where the answers were before the questions finished forming. Pressure didn't speed him up. Big moments didn't shrink him. He didn't look like someone trying to prove people wrong. He looked like someone doing his job at a high level. And once that tape existed, it couldn't be undone. The conversation shifted not because people wanted it to, but because it had to. When a quarterback plays with that level of command, the argument that he's not ready starts to sound less like analysis and more like resistance. What stood out most wasn't just the throws. It was the leadership between them. Sanders communicated clearly. He adjusted protections. He kept teammates aligned. There was no visible panic, no emotional swing that betrayed the moment. The game slowed down for him, and when that happens, everything around the quarterback speeds up in the right way. That composure had been questioned repeatedly before this performance. The idea that Sanders hadn't faced enough adversity or couldn't manage NFL-level pressure was central to the criticism. This game directly challenged that narrative. He didn't just survive pressure. He neutralized it. When analysts talk about intangibles, this is what they mean even if they rarely define it well. Command. Confidence without recklessness. Authority without theatrics. Sanders showed all of it in real time, on a stage where excuses disappear fast. The ripple effect was immediate. The Browns looked different with Sanders leading the offense. The operation felt cleaner. Possessions had purpose. There was no sense of improvisation for survival. This wasn't about flash. It was about control. And with that control came a larger realization. This wasn't a fluke. The performance fit into a pattern of steady improvement. Each week had shown growth, but this was the first time the full picture snapped into focus for everyone watching at once. When a quarterback reaches that point, evaluations change quickly. What once looked like projection starts to feel like confirmation. The Browns didn't just get a good game. They got clarity. And clarity forces decisions. After the game, the tone around Sanders shifted dramatically. Questions weren't framed with doubt anymore. They were framed with curiosity about what comes next. Development was no longer hypothetical. It was visible. Sanders didn't lean into the noise. He didn't take shots at critics. He didn't posture. He spoke the same way he played, calm, direct, grounded. That mattered. It reinforced the idea that this wasn't a moment built on emotion. It was built on preparation. For media figures who had been openly skeptical, this was the uncomfortable part. Because now the evidence was undeniable, and the prior takes were on record. Behind the scenes, the Browns had been watching the same progression. Practice habits, film study, command and meetings. None of it happened overnight. This game wasn't a surprise internally. It was a reveal externally. That context matters because it reframes the criticism. Sanders didn't suddenly become capable. He arrived at a point that development was always pointing toward. The gap between perception and reality closed in one afternoon. When the Browns named Sanders the starting quarterback for the remainder of the season, it wasn't a reward. It was an acknowledgement. The team responded to what was happening on the field, not what had been said about him off it. This decision carried weight beyond the Browns. Around the league and across media platforms, the tone shifted fast. Analysts who had questioned Sanders' readiness began reframing their positions. The language softened. Certainty gave way to reassessment. Colin Cowherd was part of that shift. The backtracking didn't come as an apology, but it came as a pivot. The emphasis moved from what Sanders supposedly lacked to what he had clearly demonstrated. The same performance that had once been predicted as unlikely was now being analyzed for sustainability. That's how quickly the ground moves in sports media. One performance can dismantle weeks of confident skepticism. And when it does, it exposes how fragile some narratives really are. This moment wasn't about humiliation or victory laps. It was about correction. Sanders didn't need to respond verbally to critics. The game did that for him. What this performance ultimately proved was simple. Consistent excellence forces honesty. You can debate projections. You can argue timelines. But when a quarterback shows poise, accuracy, leadership, and control under pressure, the conversation has to evolve. Shedeur Sanders changed the conversation by doing exactly what critics said he couldn't. And once that happens, there's no going back to the old take. If you've been watching how quickly narratives flipped after this game, drop your thoughts below. Was this inevitable, or did it take one undeniable performance to force reality into the spotlight? If this breakdown helped clarify what really happened, make sure to like the video, share it with someone still stuck on the old narrative, and subscribe for more deep dives into how one game can change everything. Colin Cowherd's recalibration wasn't subtle. It came with the tone of someone pretending this had always been part of the plan. He didn't say, "I was wrong," but the reworded takes did the job. Now it was about Sanders' maturity. Now it was about how well he adapted. The pivot was surgical, but the timestamps don't lie. This is the part of the media cycle where narrative integrity takes a hit. When someone like Cowherd builds an entire segment doubting a player's NFL upside, then seamlessly pivots to praise once that same player outperforms expectations, it raises a simple question. Were you analyzing the tape or just vibing with the headlines? And to be fair, it's not just Cowherd. The entire media apparatus functions like this, driven by moment-to-moment performance instead of long-term observation. Sanders just happened to expose it on a national scale. Sanders, meanwhile, handled the attention the same way he handled the pocket, with composure. At the podium after the game, he didn't posture or poke. He acknowledged the performance, praised his teammates, and kept the conversation centered on preparation. That's what made it land even harder. The critics were spiraling, reshaping their takes in real time, while Sanders was already looking at next week's tape. The contrast between media chaos and player focus couldn't have been clearer. When a quarterback keeps stacking growth like this, it creates momentum that even the most resistant analyst can't fight. At a certain point, you either adjust the take, or get left behind by the truth. The game against the Bengals became a tipping point. Not because of the stat line, though it was impressive, but because of how Sanders controlled the entire flow. The Browns weren't just running a game plan. They were executing a quarterback-led strategy. There were no wasted motions. Timing was tight. Blitzes were absorbed and countered. This wasn't rookie panic, it was veteran rhythm. And the Bengals' defense isn't exactly soft. Sanders made them look like they were reacting instead of dictating. For fans who had been unsure, this was the proof. And for the doubters? This was the wall they couldn't climb anymore. Every drive felt like a direct contradiction to the critiques that had dominated sports talk for weeks. The photos that came out from the game told the same story: calm face, tight throws, command in the huddle. There was no panic in his eyes, no hesitation in his motion. Every frame captured the same thing: a quarterback in full control of the moment. The visual narrative mattered here, especially for a player like Sanders who's had his media presence dissected from day one. These weren't highlight reels designed to go viral. They were honest snapshots of a performance that spoke for itself. And in an NFL landscape that's always hunting for the next guy, this game made a strong argument that the Browns might have just found theirs. What made this all the more impactful was the build-up. Sanders didn't come out of nowhere. He wasn't a media afterthought who surprised everyone with one big outing. He was heavily scrutinized from the moment he stepped onto the NFL stage. People questioned his decision-making. They questioned his mechanics. They doubted his ability to transition from the college system. Every step of his path came with loud commentary, and he answered all of it the only way that counts: performance. When Sanders speaks now, it lands differently. He's no longer a prospect being judged on upside. He's a quarterback shaping outcomes and forcing experts to reconsider what they thought they knew. The broader implications for the Browns can't be overstated. For a franchise that cycled through quarterback options like a playlist on shuffle, finding consistency at the position changes everything. Play calling, roster planning, even locker room culture, it all stabilizes. And Sanders is bringing that stability through execution, not hype. His presence is elevating the offense in real time. The receivers look sharper. The run game benefits from balanced play calling. The entire team is adjusting to a version of football that finally has structure at QB. For Cleveland fans, this isn't just hope, it's evidence. And after years of quarterback purgatory, evidence means everything. But the road here wasn't smooth. Earlier in the season there were bumps. Sanders was sidelined briefly with a minor issue, and the buzz started again. Can he handle the grind? Is he too fragile for the league? The questions were ready to pounce. He returned without fanfare and got back to work. No dramatic comeback post. No overdone promo videos. Just a quarterback stepping back in like he never left. That's what changed the perception. He didn't force the spotlight, he earned it by staying consistent. Sometimes the most powerful thing a player can do is not react at all. Sanders understood that. While others overanalyzed, he just prepared. In his interviews post-game, that same mindset came through. He talked about reads. He broke down sequences. He wasn't emotional, he was methodical. And that unnerved the critics more than anything. This was supposed to be a kid with too much flash and not enough substance. But here he was, dissecting defenses with the vocabulary of a 10-year vet. The maturity wasn't performative. It was real. When a quarterback shows you they understand the game at that level, it changes how the league sees them. The learning curve flattens. The potential label drops. And the conversation shifts to what's next, not what's missing. Now, with a full season's worth of NFL footage, the story is undeniable. Sanders hasn't just had flashes, he's built a portfolio. Consistent footwork. Smart decisions. Minimal turnovers. It's all on tape. Analysts who were once hesitant are now pulling out advanced stats to justify their new optimism. But the truth is, the eye test passed weeks ago. The film doesn't lie. And the old doubts don't hold up under the weight of execution. That's how quickly narratives can collapse when they're built on assumptions instead of observation. Sanders didn't need to argue with anyone. He just needed time. The Titans game brought it full circle. The pressure was high. Expectations had shifted. Sanders was no longer playing for validation, he was playing to maintain control. And he did. Big throws, clean execution, control over tempo. He didn't need a comeback moment. He just needed 4 quarters of command, and he gave the Browns exactly that. This was no longer a breakout. It was a pattern. And when a young quarterback starts turning one-off performances into habits, that's when the league takes notice. That's when scouts start reshaping their draft boards. That's when analysts stop talking and start watching. By the time Shedeur Sanders walked into his next press conference, the vibe had shifted completely. There wasn't a single question about whether he could play at this level anymore. The conversation had moved on. Now it was about where this ceiling could possibly stop. And he wasn't surprised. That was the part that stood out. There wasn't any gloating. He knew this version of himself had always existed. He just needed the opportunity and time to show it without the noise choking every step. When asked about the media shift, Sanders didn't flinch. That's part of it, he said straight-faced. It's always going to change based on results. I just stay locked in. You could feel the discomfort in the room from reporters who had recently questioned his poise. That's the quiet victory. As the Browns kept winning, the Sanders effect became impossible to ignore. The tempo of the games changed. The playbook opened up. Opposing defenses had to game plan for his eyes just as much as his arm. And most importantly, he turned the Browns from a chaotic boom-or-bust team into something far more dangerous, predictably good. That's not a headline grabber, but in the NFL it's everything. Predictable execution wins games. And now, when the Browns took the field, there was no longer a question about what kind of quarterback they had. They had the quarterback. Critics had to move on from questioning his decision-making to debating whether he was already better than half the starters in the league. That's how fast the narrative reformed itself around his. One clip, one moment at a time, Sanders was building a reel that silenced the last holdouts. He wasn't just making throws, he was making the right throws. Tight window lasers on 3rd and long. Touch passes under zone. Quick outs under blitz. It was all there. He wasn't leaning on highlight plays to make his case. It was the boring, correct decisions drive after drive that made the impact. That's what separates good from great. And that's what started to rattle the talking heads who had pegged him as a gimmick player. Every week, new stats surfaced. QB rating climbs. Turnover ratio stays clean. Completion percentage stays high. And yet, Sanders barely referenced any of it. He let the tape speak, because it said everything they needed to hear. The 49ers matchup was supposed to be the reckoning. That was the week the skeptics circled on their calendars. A top-tier defense. A nationally televised game. If there was ever a moment for Sanders to be exposed, this was it. Instead, he dissected them. Short game, long game, tempo control. He took what they gave him. He neutralized pressure with quick releases. He didn't try to be the hero, he just delivered clean, cold football. And by the fourth quarter, it was the 49ers defense that looked confused, not Sanders. From that point on, no one with a microphone could pretend this wasn't real. Because when you go toe-to-toe with a Super Bowl caliber defense and walk away standing, the excuses fall flat. Then came the Raiders game. Another opportunity for him to stumble. Another chance for the told-you-so crowd to resurface. And once again, Sanders gave them nothing. He absorbed hits. He managed the clock. He made the throws that weren't flashy but kept the offense alive. The defense helped, sure, but Sanders was the one holding the reins. Every possession told the same story: control, discipline, leadership. That's when fans started believing this wasn't a hot streak. It was the new normal. The Raiders came in expecting to rattle a young QB. They left realizing they'd underestimated a grown man with a playbook and a mission. And even during the week, the whispers from inside the building started leaking out. Coaches were praising his command in the film room. Teammates were calling him steady. Veteran players were backing his leadership behind the scenes. It wasn't just a performance thing, it was cultural. At practice, Sanders wasn't just showing up, he was setting tempo. The same calm he brought on Sundays showed up in walkthroughs. And that calm was contagious. For a Browns organization that has lived through quarterback turbulence for over a decade, that kind of steady presence means everything. You don't get that from hype. You get it from a quarterback who knows who he is and what he's doing. Rewind to preseason. This wasn't the version of Sanders that the media wanted to believe in. Back then, the headlines were about overthrows, delayed reads, and media buzz outweighing tape. But watching the growth from those early preseason games to now feels like watching two different players. Not because he reinvented himself, but because he refined himself. The footwork cleaned up. The timing synced. The overreaction stopped. The same people who clipped his preseason mistakes into viral, "he's not ready" montages are now pretending those takes never happened. Sanders didn't delete those moments. He just added better ones on top until no one remembered. When he sat down for a mid-season interview, Sanders reflected on the journey without drama. "I know who I am. I know what I've been working on. So I don't need to respond to everything." That line hit differently. Because that's what flipped the media on its head. Not just the stats but the stillness. He didn't chase the spotlight. He outlasted the noise. And the NFL respects that. The media doesn't always. But when the two collide, when someone becomes undeniable both on and off the field, you get the exact scenario we're watching now, a full-blown narrative reversal. Even the back injury moment, which once raised concerns, now feels like a minor plot point. He handled the rehab privately. Didn't milk it for attention. Didn't dramatize his return. Just kept showing up ready. That told the Browns front office more than any stat line. It wasn't just about physical durability, it was about how he mentally navigated adversity. A younger, less poised quarterback might have turned that into a spectacle. Sanders turned it into fuel. Now, when he walks into post-game pressers, the tone of the room is different. No more trap questions. No more leading hypotheticals. He answers like a guy who knows the microscope isn't going away, but also knows it can't hurt him anymore. Because once a quarterback proves he can win under pressure, grow under criticism and lead without theatrics, the doubters run out of oxygen. Shedeur Sanders didn't beg for respect. He made it obvious. And now, every major sports show is stuck rewriting their intros. He didn't just flip the narrative, he crushed it under the weight of consistent, undeniable proof. So here we are, months removed from the takes that said he wasn't built for this. And somehow Shedeur Sanders didn't just survive the heat. He walked through it without flinching and turned the spotlight into proof. That's the thing with narratives, they move fast but they crash even faster when they're built on thin air. What Sanders did was force people to confront reality. You can't argue around execution. You can't spin leadership. When a quarterback consistently performs, stays composed and grows week after week, even the loudest critics have to hit the brakes. Now the question isn't, can he do it? It's, how far can he take this? And that's the scariest question for everyone who wrote him off. Because if this is what the early chapter looks like, what happens when the story really gets going? Let us know what you think. Has Sanders officially arrived as a franchise QB? Or are you still waiting for more? Either way, drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit like if you're done entertaining bad takes. Share this with someone who doubted and disappeared. And if you're here for the players who rewrite the script in real time, you're going to want to subscribe. Because this league doesn't wait, and neither do we.